As of today, it was estimated that Ukraine has knocked out roughly 421 Russian airplanes and around 340 helicopters since February 2022. Turned out that the impressive Russian air power everyone feared, instead of swarming Ukrainian skies, is trending on battlefield casualty charts instead. Why did it happen? I mean, in Syria, they claimed air superiority. In Ukraine, not even close. What went wrong with the Russian invaders? How exactly Russian propagandists sold this so-called air dominance in glossy media, and how that narrative collapsed under the weight of reality. Let's get into it. Alright, let's meet the stars of Russia's mighty Air Force show. First up, the Su-25 attack aircraft. It's a true Soviet classic designed in the late 70s, because we all know how much Russians enjoy retro stuff. Think of it as flying AK-47. I mean, it's rugged, it's cheap, and about as stealthy as a fridge. Su-25 is perfect for low-level bombing, of course if your enemy doesn't own Stingers, Starstreaks, or literally any modern air defense, which Ukraine does. Then there's the MiG-31. This beast was meant to hunt bombers in the Arctic during the Cold War. In reality, it's mostly used to take off over terror Russia, launch a single Kinjal missile, and land back in the terror Russia. Moving on, the pride of the Russian fleet, the Su-35 and Su-37. Those were supposed to be Russia's answer to the F-15 and F-22, at least on paper or in those really cool CGI promo videos from Digital Combat Simulator. These are super maneuverable Russian jets. They can dance in air shows, they can flip, they can spin, they can do even a backflip if you ask nicely, but the reality check proved that doing the Cobra maneuver doesn't really save you from Ukraine's air defense missiles. And then, ladies and gentlemen, the unicorn of Russian aviation, the mythical Su-57. This one is positioned as Russian supermodern 5th generation stealth fighter, which is the true stuff of Hollywood. Except in reality, Russia built, maybe a dozen of them, and most of those aircraft prefer to hang out at air bases in Russia, far away from anything that shoots back. So what was the plan that Russians came up with? It was really simple: sweep the skies in the first 48 hours, bomb Ukrainian air defenses, and then own the air like Russians did in Syria. Let's take a closer look at the Russian Air Force's demise in Ukraine, starting right from day one of the invasion. Because the truth is, it was more like a slow-moving disaster than a blitzkrieg in the sky. On 24th of February 2022, one of the first big moments was when a Russian Su-35, their so-called super maneuverable fighter jet, got shot down near the capital. The Ruski pilot apparently bailed out, but the reports say that his parachute failed to open, which wasn't the only case. Actually, there were numerous reports on finding Russian pilots around Ukraine still strapped to their seats. Then there's the Su-34, Russia's modern strike bomber that was supposed to shred Ukraine's defenses. Several of these got blasted out of the sky early on, one near Kyiv in March 2022 and another near Chernihiv. Ukrainian air defenses used a mix of Soviet-era complexes like S-300s and later Western-supplied systems, and this effectively neutralized what was meant to be Russia's precision air power. And what's interesting is that Ukrainian pilots flying those MiG-29s, basically Soviet relics, scored some of the most impressive early kills. Much to Moscow's embarrassment, Ukrainian ace Andriy Pirshikov, aka Juice, flying the comparably older MiG-29, even downed several modern Russian jets, including a Su-35 and a Su-30. Already by spring 2022, it was absolutely clear that Russian air dominance was a pipe dream. Ukrainian S-300s, Ukrainian Buk missiles, and a flood of Western-supplied manpads effectively destroyed Russian dreams of a blitzkrieg in the sky, and the number of Russian casualties in terms of pilots and aircraft started to grow dramatically. The terror Russian pilots found themselves in a real nightmare, flying over a country that had not only modernized its air defense but also learned from past conflicts. Unlike Syria, where Russian airplanes could bomb civilians with no resistance whatsoever, Ukraine gave Russia a brutal reality check. By the end of 2022, Russian air operations were basically reduced to things like missile strikes from safe distance, thousands of kilometers from Ukraine's border, and dropping gliding bombs, again from a safe range of 70–90 kilometers from the target. The much feared and superior Russian Air Force had been humbled, and the losses among the terror Russian pilots and aircraft tell the real story. Now I would like to talk about something really important, specifically Russian A-50 early warning aircraft, the so-called flying radars. At the beginning of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Russia reportedly had up to 10 operational A-50s. They were absolutely critical for the Russian Air Force and also for the land force, because once in the air, they could spot Ukrainian radars, they could guide cruise missiles, and coordinate fighter sweeps. Without them, Russia's jets are just flying blind. The first major strike took place on January 14, 2024, when Ukraine shot down an A-50U over the Sea of Azov using a comparably old S-200 surface-to-air missile. Estimated 10 Russian crew members died, including 5 majors, and suddenly Russia had one fewer radar operating in the sky. Then another one in February 2024, again an A-50U, this time over the Russian Krasnodar region, and again using a long-range S-200 missile. By February 25, Ukraine's intelligence chief announced that Russia now only had about 6 operational A-50s left. Now, what about the repairs? So the Taganrog plant, that is the only major A-50 maintenance hub, was itself hit by the Ukrainian drone strikes in March 2024, and even if damage was minor, a lot of those airplanes were grounded, awaiting parts or maintenance, and we all understand that Russia's defense industry simply cannot provide replacements on demand. And then came Ukraine's legendary Operation Spiderweb, using 117 tiny drones smuggled into Russia. In just a single day, Kyiv damaged or destroyed around 41 aircraft, including at least 2 A-50s. The satellite images and drone footage later showed some of those A-50s with their radar domes ruined, and analysts pointed out that Russia now risks barely having 3 surviving operational aircraft. Without these aircraft, Russian operations become disjointed. Cruise missiles fly blind, fighter escorts suffer gaps in terms of situational awareness, and strategic coordination basically collapses. Strategic bombers Tu-95s, Tu-22s were also hit by Spiderweb. Even assuming fewer were destroyed than it was claimed, the strike still targeted about 1/3 of Russia's bomber fleet in one go. This made long-range missile barrages against Ukrainian cities far less effective and far less frequent. And can Russia replace those losses? That's highly doubtful. A-50s are Soviet relics. These aircraft are ultra-complex and no longer in production. And speaking of strategic bombers like Tu-95, Tu-22 series, similar story. The production is so thin that there is no easy replacement. Basically, what Russia does right now is slowly disposing of its strategic fleet until they have no more. And you probably think that the Russians must have concentrated on producing modern aircraft instead. Let's talk about this one. Russian Su-57, the most feared aircraft in the world, according to the Russian media and computer games. In 2019, Russia signed a contract for 76 Su-57s to be delivered by 2028. But as it usually happens in corrupted terror Russia, the things went south. 5 aircraft were delivered in 2021, 7 in 2022, and around 10 more in 2023. So roughly 20 aircraft in service by early 2024, and only a few of those were actually operational, according to the analysts. Then comes Ukraine's drone strike on June 8, 2024 at Akhtubinsk airfield, which is almost 600 kilometers inside Russia. One Su-57 was hit by a drone and obviously damaged really bad because satellite images showed scorch marks, craters, and this fighter jet clearly mangled on the apron. This was the very first known attack on the Russian Su-57 in the history of humankind. We know that maybe one or two were actually hit because the reports vary, but even losing one represents a 5% hit to the whole Su-57 fleet of the terrorist federation. So why don't they fly those advanced aircraft over Ukraine? For starters, because of reputation, of course. Losing a Su-57 in combat would be a massive propaganda hit, and we know how much Russians care about propaganda. Russia clearly keeps them parked well beyond reach and showcases them more as prestige toys than combat assets. However, there were reports of those aircraft conducting long-range missile launches, but again, far beyond Ukraine's border. As for planned production rates, Moscow aimed for 16 per year, maybe ramping to 40-50 annually in future years. But in reality, the Western sanctions and lack of high-end microelectronics make it impossible for the Russian terrorists to produce those airplanes in such quantities. The Su-57 was supposed to be the stealth star of Russia's air arsenal. Instead, it's barely operational, it's rarely used, and already dented by Ukrainian drones. And with that, my dear friends and family, I wish you all a beautiful day. I'll see you in the comments, and of course, don't forget to subscribe. I'm Operator Starsky. Thanks for watching.